For when God made a promise to Abraham, since he had no one greater by whom to swear, he swore by himself, saying, surely I will bless you and multiply you. And thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. For people swear by something greater than themselves, and in all their disputes an oath is final for confirmation. So when God desired to show more convincingly to the heirs of the promise the unchangeable character of his purpose, he guaranteed it with an oath, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain, where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. You can be seated. I remember as a kid playing with friends out in the yard, and something would inevitably happen where you would have to swear that something that you said or did was true. Maybe you're playing wiffle ball and it's questioned whether or not you actually touched the base as you were rounding, and you're questioned on whether or not you did that, and you're like, I swear I did. And then if you needed to really, really up the ante to make sure that you were believable, you would say something to the effect of, I swear on my grandma's grave I touched that base, right? Or I swear on my mama's life, right? Things like that. Anybody ever take any oaths like that as a kid? Yeah, it's almost always guys too, by the way. Almost always it's the boys who do it most of the time. Yeah. What is it about that? What are we doing when we do that? Why does that work also? Like, why is it that you're playing a game with your friends and all of a sudden mom's life has to come up, you know? But it works. They're like, okay, he swore on his mom's life. I'm going to take his word for it. Why does that happen? It works because it's tapping into something deeply ingrained in us about trust. You see, kids don't always have the credibility that adults do, and they lack authority. So what happens is when their word is doubted, they resort to an oath to do what? To reinforce the sincerity. Okay? You may not take my word for it, but here's what I'm staking my word on. My mama's life, my grandma's grave, or my own life. I swear by my own life. That's why we do it. It ups the ante, right? It makes what we're saying more meaningful. It raises the stakes, and it signals we really mean this. We do this as adults too in courts of law. Do we still swear on a Bible in court? I don't know if you're allowed to do that. Okay, yeah. Sorry, it's 2025. Who knows what we're doing these days, right? Yeah, so what happens? If you're going to be a witness in court, you put your hand on a Bible and you raise your right hand and you say, I swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God. Now ask yourself this question. Why do we do that? What's the deal with that? Why not just say, I'm going to say the true stuff up here? Why is it that they say, nope, we want you to put your hand on a Bible and swear to God you're going to tell the truth? Because what we're asking that person to do is to stake what they're saying on a higher authority. In other words, when we're doing that, what we're saying is this: I swear that what I say is true, or I'll have to deal with God if it's not. That's what we're saying. And why does our court system want us to do that? Well, because ultimately we don't know if somebody's ever telling the truth. We don't really know for sure that what comes out of their mouth is accurate. So here's what we want them to do. We want them to appeal to an authority higher than them to guarantee the accuracy of what they say. We make them swear an oath. And what we're ultimately doing, whether you're in the backyard as a kid or whether you're in a courtroom testifying, is what we're saying is, trust me. Trust what I'm saying. We're trying to garner trust. We're trying to solidify that what we are saying can be banked on. Today in our passage, we're going to look at God taking an oath to us. We're going to look at God telling us that there is an absolute certainty to his promises. There's an absolute bankable assurance in Christ that we have. If you've ever asked yourself a question to this effect, how do I know that what God says is going to happen? How can I be sure that everything he says will come to pass? How can I be certain? How can I have peace to know that I'm truly forgiven? Or any other question of that effect. How can I know that what God has said ultimately is what will be? The answer that comes your way is seen in our text today, and essentially it's God saying, I swear to you. And when he swears to us, he appeals to the highest authority that he can appeal to, himself. I want us to look at this passage back this morning. If you think about Hebrews 6, 1 through 8, we looked at the warnings of not staying the course, not enduring. And then last week, Pastor Nick talked about in verses 9 through 12, the assurance that we have in Christ, right? There's warnings of don't stray, don't go away, right? There's these warning texts telling us, stay the course to the end, endure to the end. And then there's the promises that assure us that he won't lose us, he'll keep us. What we're going to look at today is the continuation of that assurance, but the assurance is rooted not in you, the assurance is rooted in God. God can't change his purposes. God can't lie. God cannot lose his people. And we're going to look at this text through the lenses of 3 points. Here's our first one, his immutable purpose. God's immutable purpose. So God has made a promise, and this is what the Hebrew writer appeals to in verse 13. He says, when God made a promise to Abraham. So watch, immediately he's taken readers back to the Old Testament, to a promise made to Abraham. You go, when did God make a promise to Abraham? God made a promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, Genesis chapter 15. It's essentially the same promise. God calls Abraham to leave his home, and he says, I'm going to make you a nation. I'm going to build you into a people, and you're going to be my people, and I'm going to be your God. Now, the elephant in the room, as that promise is being made, is that Abraham has no people. He has no children. The other elephant in the room is that he and his wife are really old. So this promise is coming, but it's kind of a whopper. It's like, whoa, you're going to make me into a nation and we have no kids and we're already really old? And the promise is, yes. I'm going to build you into a great nation. I'm going to be your God. And your people are going to number as many as the sands on the shore. Your people are going to number as many as the stars in the sky. Look up there, Abraham. You see that? Do you see the firmament? Your people will be as many as that. Now, ultimately, this promise is not just to Abraham or to Isaac or to Jacob or to the 12 sons of Jacob or to the people of Israel who came from those 12 sons. Ultimately, the promise is to us. Because the fulfillment of that promise is the offspring of Abraham known as Christ. Matthew's gospel opens with the genealogy of Jesus Christ, the son of Abraham, son of David. He is the promised offspring that is going to make a people of God of every nation, tribe, and tongue, as numerous as the sand, as numerous as the stars in the sky. But I want you to notice here at verse 17. Verse 17, it says, so when God desired to show more convincingly. So God says, I'm going to do this, but just so that it's even more convincing, what does he say? When he wants to show more convincingly the heirs of the promise, his unchangeable character, his purposes, he guarantees it with an oath. I want you to notice that phrase there, the unchangeable character of his purpose. The unchangeable character of his purpose. In other words, God is always working his plan. God is not rolling the dice and watching what unfolds. God never says, oops. God never says, whoa. God never says, didn't expect that one. God never says anything like that. God is working all things according to the counsel of his will from the foundation of the world. His unchangeable purpose, it's fixed. Think about this. Think about when sailors in the ancient world, before they had compasses or any modern technology, Matt, how psycho was it to go through the ocean back in those days? Okay? No technology. You're just out there in the ocean, just just out there doing it? What did they use for navigation in those days? The stars. And what particular star was really important to their navigation? The North Star. You're all little sailors, huh? You're little smarty pants, all right? So think about this. Why is that? Why was the North Star so important? Because it was what? What's the word? Fixed. Immovable. The North Star is something they could all, regardless of what was happening, whether or not they were disoriented, whether there was waves, wind, regardless of what was happening, they could always find the North Star, and they knew their navigation points because it was fixed. This is what the Hebrew writer is saying. The reason you can bank on God's promises is because they're fixed. They're fixed in accordance to his purposes that do not change. Now, I want you to think about this. I think this is fascinating. It's interesting that the Hebrew writer appeals to the story of Abraham when wanting to encourage believers who are going through hardships that God's purposes never change. And the reason why it's fascinating that he uses Abraham as the example is because he talks about patience. Notice he says, thus Abraham, having patiently waited, obtained the promise. If you've read Genesis, I don't think you walk away thinking like, yeah, Abraham and Sarah were so patient. Right? We literally are going through Genesis, right? We go through blocks of the Bible, 10 or 12 weeks at a time. We've gone through all of this with Abraham in Genesis. And patience is probably not the first word that comes to your mind when you think about their story. But why is it what he's appealing to? Because the promise given to Abraham was not fulfilled quickly. It was not fulfilled quickly. Okay? It wasn't a fast promise. And the Hebrew writer tells us that Abraham waited patiently. Now, the reason we don't see Abraham and Sarah as waiting patiently, right, is because we think about all the struggles they had, and we think about even their own little plan of like, here, we'll do it through Hagar, and I'm sure nothing will go wrong with that, and right? And so we don't see them as waiting patiently. But we miss the point when we think about it like that, because here's the deal. Patience is not patience unless there is a lag or a delay. Everybody thinks they're patient until something doesn't happen at the timing they want. You only get to practice patience when you have to wait for something, when something is delayed in being fulfilled. Right? True patience only materializes when something is slow or delayed in coming. For example, my two daughters, when it's time to leave, require for me to have patience. Okay? Because they're never ready to go when it's time to go. I don't know what they're doing. I have no clue why it's impossible to move at the pace that I move at, but they don't. And so if we're going to we're going to go somewhere, I need to give them an hour head start before I need to actually have them get ready to leave, okay? Patience. The very essence of patience, watch this, is not that we love our situation as we wait. The very essence of patience is not that we're chipper and it's like, oh man, I love delayed fulfillment of the promise. No, that's not what patience is. It's that we're able to cope with the burden of and see through the frustrations. Doesn't mean we don't have frustration. Doesn't mean it's not burdensome as we wait. It means that we're able to see it through. We're able to continue with. Sinclair Ferguson, one of my favorite theologians, he says this: one of the great paradoxes of God's ways with us is that God is determined to be frustrating to you. You say, what? How so? Because unless he is frustrating to you, you'll begin to confuse your will for your life with God's will for your life. You will think of yourself as a very patient person as long as God does what he is supposed to do in your life. In other words, you'll think of yourself as a really patient person so long as God always acts at the time you want him to act. And if he doesn't act in the timing that you want him to act, that's when you begin to struggle. And that's why Sinclair Ferguson said, God is determined to be frustrating to you because he wants you to have to lean on him in the waiting. Patience implies waiting or delay in something. But the writer is reminding his hearers, and he's reminding us this morning, that God's purposes, in fact, do not change. They are immutable, and they are anchored from the foundation of the world. And this is one of the reasons why you should have confidence as you wait. Now let's look at the second thing. Let's look at the impossible act. The impossible act. So not only do we have an immutable purpose, we have an impossible act. Look at verse 18. Verse 18 says, so that by two unchangeable things, in which it is impossible for God to lie, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We are told that it is impossible for God to lie. Now, why does the Hebrew writer bring this up? He wants us to see that there are two unchangeable things that should give us confidence. Number one, God's immutable purposes that we just talked about. Number two, God himself. God himself is an encouragement to us that God's promises will come to pass. Why is that important? Because God can't lie, he says. God can't promise to do something or determine to do something and then not be able to do it or to go against it. God cannot lie. And this is important because what God is going to do is he's going to swear an oath against his own character that he will uphold his promises. He cannot lie in relationship to the word of his promise. He cannot lie in relationship to his character. He cannot lie in relationship to the oath of his covenant. Now, here's a side note that I think is actually pretty funny. The Hebrew writer is telling us it's impossible for God to do something while appealing to the story of Abraham and the story of Sarah and that whole thing. And the most famous passage perhaps in all of it is Genesis 18, where Sarah laughs when she gets the news she's going to have a baby. And the Lord goes, why'd you laugh? And she's like, I didn't laugh. And he's like, oh yeah, you did. You laughed. I heard it. Don't laugh. And then the question is asked, is anything impossible for God? And the answer is not given because it's a given. The answer is what? No, nothing is impossible for God. And the Hebrew writer says, yeah, nothing is impossible for God. Remember the whole Abraham story? Also, there is something impossible for God. He will not lie. He will not go against his own character. He will not go against what he has sworn. God solidifies this promise by taking an oath to us to keep his promise. And when he goes to take the oath, just so that we know that he's swearing by the highest authority, he swears by himself. He says, I swear on my own name. Look at verse 16. For people swear by something greater than themselves, which is, by the way, why it works out in the yard playing wiffle ball. Why it works in the court of law, right? You're not swearing by your own name. You're swearing by a greater authority. No one swears an oath by themselves, but by a greater authority. And in all disputes, an oath is a final confirmation. It's the cherry on top. It's the way to go, okay, they really mean business. I was watching the OJ documentary on Netflix, by the way. I was a teenager when all that happened. I vaguely remember it. And then when I went back and watched it, I'm like, okay, yeah. I mean, it's like, how did that guy make it out of court? Okay, so anyway, but I was reminded, this is where I was getting, it showed all the people getting up and testifying. And it just struck me. It was like every time somebody got up, swear to tell the truth. It's like, yeah, well, we don't know. So what do? We say, tell us you really mean it. Swear to a higher authority that we can actually trust what you're saying. Why? Because, well, justice is at stake. People's lives are at stake. We have to know you're telling the truth. Here's the amazing thing. The Hebrew writer says that God never lies. And even though that God never lies, and even though he cannot lie, he goes to the extent of taking an oath. Think about this. If God never lies, why does he need to go to any extra measures to make sure that we know he's telling the truth? He doesn't do it for himself. Who does he do it for? For us. God goes the extra mile to give us double reassurance. I will never go back on my promise. I will never not bless you. I'm swearing against my own existence, God says. If I fail to keep my promises to you, I would rather cease to exist than to fail my people. That's what he's saying. Think about how insane that is. God says, I would rather cease to exist than to ever tell you something I didn't fulfill. What is this meant to do? This is meant to just sink deep down into your soul and anchor you. Yeah, I can bank on the promises of God. By the way, where do you see God swear this oath by his own name in the story of Abraham? It's in Genesis 15. And in Genesis 15, when God makes this covenant, he ratifies it. You remember when we talked about this? He takes these animals and he cuts them in half. So they're sacrificed and they're cut in half. And each half of the animal is put from one side against the other to make a walkway. And in ancient covenants, in ancient ratification, this would be something that people would do if they were like selling a piece of land to each other. And the person who owed the debt, the person who was under the obligation to pay something or to fulfill something, would have to walk down the middle. And essentially, as they walked down the middle, they would recite the oath and the cursings that would come with it if they didn't do it. And the reason that it had teeth is because what they were saying by their promise, by their oath, was, may I be as these slain animals if I don't do what I say. And in Genesis 15, when God says, I'm going to bless you and multiply you and make you a great nation, and the animals are cut and Abraham sets it all up, and rather than Abraham walking the middle, God goes down the middle. And essentially what God says to Abraham and to all his offspring is that, may I be as these slain, not only if I don't fulfill the obligation, but if you don't fulfill the obligation. And of course, God keeps his word, and he is slain on a cross 2,000 years later, because not only did we not keep the obligation, but him being slain on our behalf is what fulfills the obligation on our behalf. His righteousness in our account. But this is where he swears by his name as he walks the middle of the sacrifice. The Hebrew writer is reminding his listeners, guys, this promise of assurance is ours. You do not have to fear. God's purposes don't change. He's determined from the foundation of the world to save his people and sustain his people. And two, he has sworn by his own name. He can't lie, and he can't take an oath on anything greater than himself, yet he does it. He's done it for our sakes. These are the two things that he's drilling home into their hearts. And I've got an extra couple of minutes here. Don't freak out. Go over to Isaiah 48. I'm not about to Dr. Moeller you or anything. Go to Isaiah 48. I want you to see that this is not the first time that God has done such a thing. That God has appealed to his eternal purposes and to his character to anchor a promise, to anchor his ways, to anchor the things that we're banking on and counting on. Let's look at Isaiah 48 just real quick. I just want to read it to you just so you see this framework, okay? I just want you to see this appeal to his eternal purposes and an appeal to himself. Hear this, O house of Jacob, who are called by my name of Israel, and who came from the waters of Judah, who swear by the name of the Lord and confess the God of Israel, but not in truth or right. For they call themselves after the holy city and stay themselves on the God of Israel. The Lord of hosts is his name. Watch this. The former things I declared of old. They went out from my mouth, and I announced them. Then suddenly I did them, and they came to pass. Because I know that you are obstinate, and your neck is an iron sinew, and your forehead brass, I declared them to you from old. Before they came to pass, I announced them to you, lest you should say, my idol did them, my carved image and my metal image commanded them. You have heard, now see all this. And will you not declare it? From this time forth, I announce to you new things, hidden things that you have not known. They are created now, not long ago. Before today, you have never heard of them, lest you should say, behold, I knew them. You have never heard, you have never known. From old your ear has not opened, for I knew that you would surely deal treacherously, and that from before birth you were called a rebel. For my name's sake I defer my anger. For the sake of my praise, I restrain it for you, that I may not cut you off. Behold, I have refined you, but not as silver. I have tried you in the furnace of affliction. For my own sake I do it. For how should my name be profaned? My glory I will not give to another. God says, I have declared from the beginning what happens at the end. I have declared all these things that come to pass. Why? Because he's working all things according to his purposes. And then he says this, and the reason that I do it, and the reason I don't cut you off is for my name's sake. Lest I should be thought of as faithless to keep my people. I keep my word despite you not keeping it. For my own name's sake. I swear an oath to my own name, and I can't lie. So we see the immutable purpose. We see the immovable promise that God gives. Let's look at this third part, the immovable anchor. The immovable anchor. In verses 18 and 19, the Hebrew writer goes on to say, we who have fled for refuge might have strong encouragement to hold fast to the hope set before us. We have this as a sure and steadfast anchor of the soul, a hope that enters into the inner place behind the curtain where Jesus has gone as a forerunner on our behalf, having become a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. The anchor to which we hold fast is Christ. It's the gospel. It's the good news of the finished work of Jesus. The one whose righteousness is credited to our accounts. The one whose sacrificial death bears our condemnation and the wrath of God in our place. It's the hope that enters into the Holy of Holies. This is Old Testament language here of the temple, right? The Holy of Holies was the place reserved for the high priest once a year to make atonement on behalf of the people of God, to pardon and atone for sins. And it says that Jesus enters into the Holy of Holies. He goes into the inner place behind the curtain where nowhere else can go. And what does he do? He goes in there with us. We just sang about this in that song. Our name is graven in his hands. He goes on our behalf. He pleads for us, the high priest, the forerunner. What is he saying here? What is the message the Hebrew writer is aiming at? He says, listen, there's an anchor that's been thrown into the very heart of Christ, and it's tied to us too. And in a sense, Jesus will either sink or swim with us, but he will never allow the anchor to break. We are anchored to Christ. We are anchored in heaven because Christ is there seated with us in some very real ways there with him. He has gone into the very presence of God on our behalf. He appears there on our behalf. And in a very real way, he is not only steadying our feet in this world, he is carrying us into the world to come. That's why you have assurance. There's an immovable anchor that you are attached to. Think about how anchors are supposed to work. Right? You might go this way or that way, but if you're tied to the anchor at some point, the line tightens and it's going no further. Christ is the immovable anchor. What's our assurance? That we can endure the hardships and the trials? Because that's the whole context of this passage. Those who are undergoing trials and tribulations, who are waiting for the promises of God, and they're saying, are they going to come to pass? Will it happen? And he's going, guys, trust God. His purposes are eternal. His name, he's sworn on it. He won't lie. He can't lie. And he swore by himself that he's going to bring it all to pass. Oh, and by the way, the reason that you can be confident despite the waiting, despite the trials, is because the one you're anchored to is interceding and pleading on your behalf. I love the phrase that says, we who have fled for refuge. I mean, I remember reading that over the last couple weeks and I've got it underlined. I just kept going back to it going, Christ is our refuge. And immediately the question I begin to ask is, am I going consistently to him to be my refuge? And it makes me ask the question on your behalf as well. Are you fleeing to him as your refuge? I love that idea of fleeing for refuge. Have you fled for refuge? Because here's the deal. We all will flee to refuge in something. It's not whether, it's which refuge. It's not whether you'll have a refuge. It's which refuge are you looking to. You'll either seek the refuge of your own strength, the refuge of your status, your financial security, your popularity, your own attempts to try harder. You'll flee for the refuge of alcohol or drugs to relieve you of guilt. You can flee to refuges over all sorts of things. But here's the deal. You will always seek for something to be your help, to be your hope, to be your strength, to be your peace, to be your joy. You will flee somewhere. And the question is are you fleeing to Christ as your refuge? The immovable anchor. The one who hides us in himself. I love this. You who have fled to refuge might have strong encouragement to do what? To hold fast to the hope. Hold fast. I know you're struggling. I know the waiting feels like forever. I know that your eyes are saying, when will it come to pass? When will the answers come? But you have hope. You have this hope that's anchored. Hold fast to it. Hold fast. Because Jesus is that anchor to you. I shared with you guys last time I spoke about my son's birthday coming up, and that it was just one of those mile marker kind of things. He turned 21. He would have been 21 yesterday. And it's been over 5 years now. And I've shared with you guys a lot about this, but it's still just unbelievable how long it's been, and yet how short it also feels at the same time. I had the privilege of talking to the students this Wednesday about his life and all the different things that God taught me and us by having to walk and endure in the season that we had. And the message that I shared on Wednesday was about the sovereignty of God, the purposes of God in all things, even in the pain, even in the difficulty. And the one thing I emphasized was that just because you believe and trust that God is sovereign, does it make your pain less painful? Does it make your grief not hurt that bad? It doesn't plug the giant void left. I've shared with this before, but I think it bears sharing again. The days and weeks right after Caleb's passing were probably the hardest days of my life, I can say. And I didn't have a crisis of faith, but there was such a void, there was such a vacuum from his presence and his absence. Waking up on December 2nd and him being gone was just crushing. And the heaviness brought about things and realities like, on this side of eternity, I'm not going to see him again. Not going to hear him, not going to smell him, not going to touch him. Everything will be looking backwards. And guys, that's just so disorienting. And what started happening is, in the midst of just dealing with that void and that heaviness, questions begin to come up to the surface. And they're not questions that you're looking for. You're not seeking to ask those questions. It's just the circumstances start bringing stuff up. And the questions that started creeping up on me was, will I see him again? Is it all true? And I wasn't having a crisis of faith. But what was coming to the surface is everything that I believe was coming up to say, are you really, really, really believing this? Are you banking everything on it? Because I know I'm not going to see him anytime soon. But will I see him again? And you know the message I kept coming back to? You know the word I kept coming back to? You know the thing that my mind and my heart directed back to over and over and over and over? It was this. But Jesus is alive. He is not in a tomb. He rose from the dead. And if he rose from the dead, that dude is exactly who he said he was. Which means he will do exactly what he said he will do. Which means, as Paul writes, all the promises of God are yes and amen in Christ Jesus. And I kept directing my heart and my mind back to that over and over and over. Jesus is alive. Jesus is alive. He rules and reigns. The promises of God are true. All of these things are true. What was I doing? What was I doing in those weeks and months? I was preaching the truth of God's promises to my heart. I was fleeing to the refuge of Christ because he is a refuge. The truth of who Christ is a refuge to us in all things. He is the immovable anchor. He is the true north. When you are disoriented in life and everything is choppy in the waves and everything's got you disoriented, you look and you see him there. There's the true north. Christ is alive. Jesus is who he said he is. He will do what he said he will do. He shelters us. He's the high priest that goes before us. He sustains us. So I don't have to doubt not only God's salvation, I don't have to doubt God's promises. I don't have to doubt that God will sustain me. That doesn't make all of my grief disappear. It doesn't make all of the longings go away. But what it does is it anchors me. Jesus says, come to me, all who are weary, all who are burdened, heavy laden, come, and I'll give rest to your weary souls. Jesus invites all sinners and sufferers to come to him and make your refuge in him. And that's what the Hebrew writer's telling us. He swears by his own name he will do everything he says. 2 Timothy 2:13, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. He cannot deny himself. God's promises are certain in Christ. They're ours. You can stake your lives on them. You can stake your eternities on them. He has swore by his own name, and he cannot deny himself. What God has done is he has swore and taken an oath, and he looks at you and says this, trust me. Trust me.